have to make them. The law is one great tool, but we have to follow up. And whether we succeed and to what extent we succeed in that, that is, I think, up on us to participate and to collaborate in this process. And with this, I thank you.
So thanks, Professor Christian, for this very, very insightful presentation that ended up giving out a lot of information for us to follow up on the questions later on. Definitely super interesting. Let me just say thank you also to the Technical University of Munich. It's also a partner of our event, and the university from where Professor Christian ended up teaching and conducting his research activities. So without further ado, let me turn to our second speaker, our second panelist for this event. So we began with Professor Christian with a very high level take on the interplay between law, democracy, and AI. But now we need to understand a bit what we're talking about when we are addressing issues concerning AI. And some people might get confused with some technical concepts. And in order to make sure that everyone's at the same page, we would like to introduce the presentation from Professor João Paulo Papa from UNESCO. So Professor João Paulo can level up this conversation, having everyone at the same page on technical concepts, so that we can move forward with our discussion. Professor João Paulo, I understand that you have some slide decks, some slides to show as well, but I want to give the floor to you. So feel free to address the audience, and it's a pleasure to have you here this morning as well.
So thank you so much, Carlos, for the introduction. I'd like also to thank the organization committee for the invitation. Okay, so as Carlos said, we're gonna talk a little bit about on the grounds of artificial intelligence, the current research we have nowadays. So basically, I'm going to give you an introduction about some main concepts, some words that may get you a bit confused because you have a lot of information in the news. And then I'm going to talk about explainable AI and how can we use AI for good things actually. And then I'm going to give you an example related to fake news. And then lately I'm gonna draw some conclusions about what we have been thinking about it in the past decade, right? So as I said, I think it's hard to tell in just one sentence, because we may have different views of the definition of AI, but basically, I think most of us, or most of the works, they agree that AI is just some kind of if a device can take some decision based on its environment in order to fulfill some goal, that's one of the possible definitions of AI, right? So basically, it's kind of broad, right? If I have like a vacuum cleaner in my living room, and that device can capture information from from chairs and tables and every kind of thing, and take decisions, and the goal is just to clean my floor, so we can easily say that my vacuum cleaner has some sort of AI inside it. It's, it can be some controversial definition, But also in the related community, we have also, let's put it way, it's more or less a difference between AI and machine learning. Actually, in terms of, if you go like to the higher levels of abstraction, it can be the same thing. But if you go deeper, and if you have a look at the research labs and the scientists, so basically, depending on the technique these guys they're going to use, you can say, okay, you work with AI or you work with machine learning, right? That's basically some different, it's a kind of subset of research, but actually AI is the main field, and then we can have some sort of subfields that can be linked to the main AI, right? And machine learning is one of this one. And also deep learning, we have seen a lot of things about deep learning. That's because, I mean, I have some students, they just asked me, so deep learning is AI or deep learning is machine learning, and so on. So basically, deep learning can be seen as well as a subfield of artificial intelligence, actually a subfield of, let's say, machine learning, that basically concerns with some set of algorithms, some set of techniques, right? As I told you, we have like the big area, AI, and depending on if you work like neural networks, any kind of support vector machines, you can say, okay, work with machine learning. But if you work with fuzzy logic and web semantics, some people, they say, okay, I work with artificial intelligence. And if you work with a different or a very specific kind of neural networks, you can say, okay, I work with deep learning, right? It's just a matter of, different views. And related to the main strengths and issues, we can point applications in so many areas, as you can see, mainly in computer vision, that autonomous cars, we have a medical diagnosis. I'm going to give an example here for medical diagnosis and text mining as well. And a recent focus related to machine learning concerns a very controversial thing, as we have seen in the previous presentation. We can actually, neural networks can generate data synthetically, as we saw that example of deepfake, for instance. We can have neural networks that can create basically anything from scratch. So that's a good point. I'm going to show an example why is that good. But also, as you can also we can see in the news related to the fake news, for instance, it's kind of bad to use synthetic data for this kind of thing, right? So just an example here, when AI is good, right? Just an example. This is a work with some colleagues from Augsburg and OTH at Regensburg via CAPS Alexander Humboldt Research Fellowship. That's basically what we are doing here, is try to identify cancer in esophagus using AI. So you can see, a lot of these pictures here and scratches. But basically, what we can do here, instead of analyzing the whole image, we're gonna extract some patches, this little squares. We have the blue ones, if you see on the top left, there are regions of the exam endoscopy, actually.
Professor Papa, I just need to interrupt you here, because now we realize that it looks like your slides are not showing up for the audience. I don't think you have shared them. So can you share your screen so that we can have access to the slides? Sorry about that.
No worries.
Because now that you mentioned the slide and then we should see something, we're not seeing that. Sorry for interrupting
now you
on that.
Are you seeing something or not? Not yet?
Nope.
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 No, okay, just I'm gonna share my desktop actually. I'm gonna try it again.
Okay.
It working now?
We see. Yes, we see your desktop.
Oh, good.
And now
thanks.
we see your slides. Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, we just got this just text here. That's the most important one actually.
Good timing then.
Yeah. Thanks. So what do we have here? As I said, just an example. We have like these images were taken from endoscopy exam, and then we can see these blue and red squares, right? The blue ones stand for regions in which we have no problem, and the red ones stand for regions in which we possibly have cancer. The texture is different, right? Just an example of what AI is good for. But related to this application, we're gonna move here. That's the system work on the clinics, which is a good thing because you know that most of research we do, it ended up not being applied in the real world, right? So this is our research in the Augsburg hospital, actually. And then you can see in real time the endoscopy, and on the right side, the bottom right side, you can see the software analyzing the image in the real time, right? Just an example. But the thing is, what's the problem? I'd like to emphasize here, because we're talking about fake news and the problem in public administration, but I'd like to emphasize that fake data sometimes it is not that bad, right? I'm gonna give an example here. We have the left and the right column. One of these columns stands for fake endoscopy images, and the other one stands for real ones. Maybe you can try to guess, right? But the left column stands for real images, and the right one stands for images that were generated synthetically. Maybe you can realize better because the definition of the images is not that good, but it's not a problem of the machine learning algorithm. It's just basically a problem of the computational resources. I mean, if you have like better machines, we can generate better images, right? But in this case, as we deep learning algorithms, they require a lot of data, right? So, and when you're working with medical images, for instance, you don't have that much labeled data. You have a lot of data, but not labeled. I mean, we don't usually, most part of the time, we don't know that whether that image has a cancer or not. So we need to generate data synthetically. That's the point. That's the good point in this kind of fake images. So basically, we are using fake images to teach the algorithm, the neural network, to learn better. That's a good point, using fake images in medicine, right? But also, for sure, we have another view of the thing that fake data is not good, right? And then we're gonna go to the second part, the explainable AI. That's basically, usually AI algorithms, there's kind of criticism related to AI, mainly in medicine, because we say that we are doing computer assisted, but we're not doing computer assisted. We're doing computer automated decisions, which means, I mean, it's good to have a system that can say, okay, you have like 90% of probability to have some sort of disease. That's good, because an algorithm can analyze, hundreds of thousands of images in a day, in which a physician cannot do that. But the thing is, just saying that 90% of accuracy is good, or I mean, could be good, but the physician or the experts, they are not learning from this kind of information, right? So that's a good point in explainable AI. The thing is, the computers, they are kind of trying to teach the humans, and then the humans are going to teach better the algorithms, right? That's a kind of a loop that we call explainable AI, right? So we don't want computers make decisions. We want computers helping the experts, right? And also we have the application in, so some example here in application in fake news. Fake news, it's a research area that mainly uses concepts from natural language processing, NLP. And basically, the main idea is to visualize, to understand which kind of words in a sentence my machine learning algorithm use it mostly to say, okay, that's fake news or not, right? It's a kind of way trying to visualize, but that's one very much important thing here. Most of times in machine learning, fake doesn't mean bad. Fake means synthetic, right? As I told you, in this images here, we have fake data, which means synthetic data, right? But in the context of fake news, then actually in the context of fake news, if you go deeper into that, we may have two different views. Fake means synthetic, right? But also fake means that's really fake in terms of, I can have synthetic news, but they are real. I mean, they're telling something that's true, right? But they're generated synthetically. And another point is to have fake news that's okay, because fake news can also be generated synthetically, or they can be generated by a human, but they are not true. So we may have the difference between real and true, right? We need a little bit to understand that. And here I have an example for the program from an article I just took it. It was published recently, an next fake that's called, and guys from Texas A&M, Washington State University, and University of Florida. That basically they are using explainable AI here just to say, okay, let's say we have this sentence here, says the Obama administration invited Russia into Syria, right? And then we can see on the right side, we have 1 gram and 2 grams and 3 grams, just different techniques to analyze. But let's just focus on the 1 gram, for instance. You can see some words that were highlighted in green, right? These words are the most important ones to say, okay, the outcome of this algorithm is we have a 76% of probability that this sentence is fake. Mainly because we have, so what's the probability, let's say, Obama inviting Russia or Syria for something, right? So you can see the most important words here are the green ones. So just an example of how can we use explainable AI to help understand which kind of things, which kind of decisions the machines take to say, okay, this is real or fake. And just to conclude, we know that AI applications have increased a lot in the past years. I'd like to highlight once again, fake is not always bad, right? And the key thing to have better AI systems is try to understand them, try to understand how do they work, and then we can have some sort of synergy between humans and machines. That is it. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Professor Papa, for this very, very insightful presentation, full with technical concepts that are going to be useful for the rest of the conversation as well, and for bringing very provocative remarks, such as fake is not always bad, which is always a provocative thought if we think that at the very same time that we are discussing here in our House of Representatives in Brasilia, there is a public hearing going on a draft bill of law on fake news. So that's a pretty much heated debate right now, well, not only in the whole world, but especially in Brazil. Having said that, then we turn into our third panelist, which is Débora Albu. So Débora is a project coordinator at ITS Rio, at the Institute for Technology and Society of Rio de Janeiro. And Débora is going to present us some examples on how AI can empowers democracy. So it's interesting because that end up serving as the purpose that we mentioned right in the beginning of our conversation, which is to highlight how AI impacts democracy as a whole, and those impacts can be either good or bad, positive or negative, can be hard to grasp, more easy to understand sometimes. So dealing with that sort of duality, I want to give Débora the floor. So Débora, feel free to address the audience. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Carlos. I would also like to thank the German Embassy and the Technical University of Munich for organizing this event. As Carlos has already mentioned, it couldn't be a more timely moment for us to have this discussion. And just before sharing my slides, it's an anecdote I wanted to share with you, but when I was preparing this presentation, last week we had a conversation in between the panelists talking a little bit about the dynamics of this panel and how we were going to address it. And when I usually, when I have any presentation, I always like to put on Google and see what comes out as sort of like the first results of any discussion. And when I put AI and democracy, basically the first page and even the second and the third pages of results were basically the challenges brought by AI to democracies. So to some extent, we can see that even, Google's algorithm has some criticism on itself. It's sort of like a meta criticism. So trying to find the opportunities of AI for democracies was a little bit more challenging than finding the challenges itself. So let me just share my screen with you. Just a moment. There we go. Yes. Can everybody see well? Good. So just in terms of organizing my time and my speech, I'm going to talk firstly about some of the opportunities, and I'm going to go a bit deeper into them. I'm going to highlight some of the challenges, and some of them you will see have been already addressed by Professor Christian Jeffal and by Professor Papa, and will probably be addressed by researcher Orestes, but I'm going to highlight a few of them that have not been addressed just yet. And I'm going to finalize sort of in a way of looking into the future and already agreeing a lot with Professor Jeffal's take on designing AI and how we can design AI based on principles that can help us thrive for more opportunities and less challenges in that sense. So just to start, and because we're talking about democracy in this webinar, I find always interesting to bring in the concept of power and institutions. And in this, this is one of Professor Castel's latest books. I don't know if the name in English is Rupture, but in Portuguese or in Spanish, as he written, Ruptura. And in his book, it's an essay in which Castel talks a lot about what we are living in terms of new technologies, kind of bringing or fracturing institutions that are crystallized in time and that are crystallized for democracies, and that they do have power relations as a basis. And when thinking about how technology kind of disrupts these institutions, it's always important to have power at the center of the discussions. So are there opportunities for AI in democracies? And of course, the answer is yes. And I'm going to bring sort of like a framework to answer that question. And I bring here a framework of the open government principles. I'm sorry, the image is in Spanish, but I'm going to talk in English, and there's going to be translation to Portuguese, so it's going to be quite easy to understand. Open government principles are based on 3 pillars. The first one is transparency, the second, accountability, and the third, participation. And as you can see in this framework here, and that's why I kind of like this particular one, is because it has sort of like an onion kind of model to it, in which in the center, you can see sort of like the lowest levels of application of each of these 3 principles. And as you move towards the outwards of this infograph, you can see a deeper application of each of these principles. So talking, for example, about transparency, you can see that the first layer is called the reactive transparency or passive transparency. The second one would be the active transparency. And the third one is the collaborative transparency, meaning you have not only the government opening up data, opening up information, but also the population, citizens coming into the work of opening up data and collaborating for the creation of collaborative transparency. And I'm going to use this framework to talk a little bit about opportunities for AI in each of these 3 principles. So first, moving into transparency. And here, my fellow panelists have already talked a little bit about transparency for AI when we talk about the designing of AI and not understanding AI as a black box. This can be a good principle for us to start, especially when talking about the public interest as a whole and commons specifically. Once you open AI, you can bring in the legitimacy that is needed for the use of AI in democracies. Once you open what the algorithm means, how they are being used, what type of data is being collected, you can bring in citizens to legitimize the use of AI. And here, again, talking about the principle of transparency, either passive or active transparency leads to access to information. And AI plays a very interesting role in that sense. We see a lot of transparency portals. We see the case of the access to information law in Brazil and how this can actually translate into more transparency and accountability and participation as well. And transparency can also play a very important role when talking about processes. So not only in relationship from the government to the population or from the population to the government, but within the government itself, when we're talking about processes. When we're talking about processes, the idea here is that AI can bring more interesting opportunities for it. So after each of my sort of presentation of these principles, I'm going to bring a case or an example. And all of them are going to be Brazilian cases or Brazilian examples, just for the sake of us exchanging in between the German context and the Brazilian context. And this is the first example. This is a report that was done by ITS in partnership with SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. And in this report, we sort of like tried to distill a little bit of how the Brazilian judicial system is using AI. And what we have discovered is a miscellaneous of different AI models that cannot be integrated into a unique model, and that actually create a bit of a mess when applying AI in that sense. So this report brings a few recommendations of how AI could be better used to bring in together the possibilities of bettering the judicial system, making it more efficient, making it more, bringing in more efficacy to the ruling. So moving on to accountability. Talking about accountability and AI, we are talking about social control to a certain extent. And the application here, maybe the more obvious one, is regarding public expenditure. How is public expenditure being, how public expenses are being labeled, how they are being tagged? Are they going more specifically towards health, towards education? And how can I, as a citizen, have control of that and ask for and hold the government accountable in that sense? So again, we have three different levels of accountability. So the first of them is just to inform the public. The second one would be to respond to questions from the public. And the third is to hold the government accountable on the way they are making certain decisions, they are expending the way they're expending. And AI here could play a very interesting role, not only making those expenditures more efficient, but also could we even talk about predicting when or where corruption starts, what topics or what issues are more prone to corruption, or even in which context corruption can take place. And just to give you an example of maybe a context, here in Brazil, specifically in Rio, we have been, well, a couple of weeks ago, a case of corruption in public hospitals, and new public hospitals that are being constructed as a response to the pandemics have been filed up and has been, the investigation has started. Could we maybe have an AI that would have predicted that this case would have happened? So it's, again, here we're already talking a little bit about ethical issues when using AI to predict. And to give you an example again, this is Operation Serenata de Amor, or the artificial intelligence that they have created is called Rosie, as a reference to Rosie from the Jetsons, the cartoon, for the ones who remember this cartoon. And what Rosie does is it analyzes and identifies suspicion of public expenditure, specifically from parliamentarians in the Brazilian parliament, only at the federal level. But it not only does that, but it flags on Twitter. And by flagging on Twitter, it makes holding those parliamentarians accountable easier for any citizen. And this is a little bit of what Rosie does. And it was created by Open Knowledge Brazil. It's a civil society organization that really promotes open government principles, and it's really invested in promoting transparency and accountability as open government principles. Moving forward and talking about participation, which is the third principle from open government, we move from that notion of government as a service to the notion of government as platform. And what do we mean by that? We mean that government is not only an institution who should provide certain services, but also that could use the population, use the citizens, so as to develop certain services, certain platforms with it. So one of the uses here is the idea of providing public services through the help of AI, and also tapping into the collective intelligence of the population. So cases regarding crowd law, for example, are going to build upon the collective intelligence from a certain group, so as to maybe create XYZ laws. And this could be interesting in terms of applying AI. And just a disclosure here, I'm using AI as a very broad sense. We just had an explanation from Professor Papa in terms of what the specificities or the technical specificities are, but I'm using AI here as a very broad general term. And again, bringing in the levels of participation in the open government principles. So from information to empowerment. So not only are the citizens informed to make decisions, but maybe they collaborate on those decisions, and even they make the decisions themselves, which is the case of participatory budgeting, for example. And maybe I could play a role here as well. And again, to give you examples, and they are also Brazilian examples, civic chatbots in general, they do use AI, and here again, I'm using it as a very broad term, but they use AI to make something specific, to create something specifically about participation. And two examples here. The first one is Alda, the one that you see in yellow. And this chatbot was created by ITS in order to increase participation in public community on public security councils. These councils exist in the state of Rio for more than 20 years. And the level of participation and the diversity of participation is really low. And what we did was create a chatbot that would basically just inform you about when the meetings take place and how you could attend those meetings. Another example here is the one that you see in pink. It's called Beta, and she basically is a legislative radar, so as to speak, in which she pops up a message whenever a new draft bill is being moved regarding gender issues or race issues in Congress. And by popping up those messages, it also mobilizes the population so as to advocate for specifically human rights and, well, for women's rights, excuse me, and more specifically for gender equality. But there are challenges, and I'm not going to be very extensive on them, as Professor Jafal has already talked a lot about them, and researcher Orestes is going to talk, but the first of them is surveillance. So here we are talking about the principles of privacy, data protection, and ultimately trust. Surveillance means controlling citizens. The more data you have about citizens, it means that you can direct, that you can discriminate, that you can create certain rules that are going to advocate for a certain group and not for another. The second one, and here I'm going to be a bit more extensive, it's the problem of exclusion. So who are we not designing AI for? Who are we keeping off the table? So issues here of gender and race play a very important role. Talking about facial recognition and the level of error that we have in basically all the algorithms that have been created so far to recognize people and put them into categories is a problem. And of course, this problem could be mitigated by the designing of better data lakes or even better AI. But we have seen that the consequences might outweigh the benefits. And finally, the issues of bias and interpretation. So how are we sort of empowering a machine to make certain decisions when it is already created in a biased way? Finally, the issue of manipulation. Debate is a basis for democracy. So when we create algorithms that are micro-targeting and that are profiling and that are basically deconstructing the basis of democracies, we are not going to have trustworthy consensus building, and we are going to have issues of freedom of expression and disinformation. This is just a slide to show you how Brazilians consume information and how AI here might play a very important role in actually building and actually having bad consequences. The Brazilian population basically consumes its information mainly from WhatsApp. And WhatsApp is not a transparent or open social media. Even if it's a social media, we can even have that discussion. So when talking about elections more specifically, how can we actually have a grasp of what is being discussed in the public arena? So finally, what's been said already, technology is never neutral. So these principles might help us build better AI, and from then onwards actually have more positive impact. So designing, building in those principles from the beginning in the design of AI is a much better idea than actually than including them in the process of developing those specific technologies. So ethics by design, privacy by design, inclusion and openness can be good, maybe at least starting points for us to have a conversation. Thank you very much. And I turn back to Professor Carlos.
So thank you, Deborah, for this very interesting presentation. And one thing that I really like about Deborah's presentation is that this was not something that we agreed upon previously, but it's interesting how this presentation ended up linking quite nicely with the previous presentations, and we can see by the end of the presentation the importance of design when Deborah mentions ethics by design, linking with the discussion about design as a principle that Professor Christian has brought in the very first presentation. So that's the kind of conversation that we want to have, but we have one additional panelist. So after beginning with Professor Christian with a more high-level discussion and then addressing technical issues or technical concepts with Professor Papa, and now seeing some concrete examples on a more positive tone of how AI can foster democracy with some indication of principles to get this done. We need to address some other examples and see how AI can be applicable to some concrete scenarios, especially focusing something that is quite on top of our minds, which is content moderation, which is something that I want to bring along in this introduction of Dr. Orestes Papakyriakopoulos. So Dr. Orestes, you're our last speaker for this part of the event. Feel free to take your 15 minutes, and then we begin a second part in which I would ask our panelists if they have questions to each other. If not, we already have some very interesting questions coming from the audience, either from Facebook or from the YouTube channel in which this discussion is being streamed. So if you are either on the Facebook page or the YouTube channel, please feel free to send out your questions. We are taking notes and we will bring them back to the panelists right after. So Dr. Orestes, the floor is yours, and thanks again to engage in this debate. We are all looking forward to hear for your presentation. So please.
Hi, Carlos. Thank you for the introduction. I want to thank the German Embassy, the Technical University of Munich, and ITS for having me here. We heard some great presentations on how to design artificial intelligence, how artificial intelligence works, how we can govern artificial intelligence. And in my presentation, I'm going to combine some features of all these talks and talk about how artificial intelligence is employed on social media and what we can do to create civic artificial intelligence. Give me a second. I'm sorry to open my presentation. Excuse me. I'm sorry for the delay. We are now, for some reason, it doesn't appear here. So.
Dr. Orestes, if you want, we can upload your presentation here from the organization. If it works for you.
No, I think now it will be okay. Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I want to talk how we can create civic artificial intelligence, and I want to discuss especially how can we do it on social media. The aim of this talk is to make us think a little bit differently about artificial intelligence, not to think of artificial intelligence and politics the problem to solve, but we need to think on the systems that artificial intelligence appear in and how we can design them in order to have a civic political environment. On social media, algorithms appear in different ways. For example, in newsfeed generation, the contents we are seeing when we stream Twitter or Facebook or another platform. For content moderation, to remove hate speech, false information, and other content, or for political advertisement, such as micro-targeting, as previous speakers mentioned. So what do we want? We want a better democracy. We want a society that it is where equality reigns, there is justice, political freedom, and social inclusiveness. And as Deborah said, technology is not neutral, so we want technology to serve our goals and to make a political environment have these values. But what do we have? We must think. And the creator of Tim Berners-Lee back in 2000, or not of the internet, of the World Wide Web, because there's a small difference there, said in 2000 that what we actually have are social machines. And what are social machines? There are ecosystems where humans and technology appear in and interact and then participate. And in these ecosystems, such as social media platform, people are not only sociable, but become also computable. That means that they become the data that the algorithms use and are trained on to provide the service. But also technology has a social role. For example, on social media, it has the role of the news gatekeeper, which was before done by journalists. And in this ecosystem, we have specific design frameworks that shape how technology and people are going to interact. Now, if we want to say, hey, artificial intelligence influences us in a good or a bad way, and it changes politics towards a specific direction, it's not enough to just study how an algorithm behaves. We need to understand the whole political forms that appear in this ecosystem. For example, on social media, politicians talk about politics. The same applies for the public. Of course, the algorithm does influence the topics discussed and what we see, because this is why it is there. We have design principles. For example, social media platforms are designed to bring profit to the owners of these platforms. So we have specific values there that influence the algorithms and how they are designed, and in turn influence how political communication will take place. We have regulation. For example, in Brazil, we are going to soon have a law about fake news, as well as for automated decision-making processes. We also have symbolic influence. As Deborah again said, we have specific socio-political conditions embedded in the ecosystems that are reproduced when we are using them. We also have some smaller symbols that influence us. For example, if Facebook is going to be red or blue, it changes how we will interact with Facebook. So we have different things that interact with each other and influence us, and influence also the algorithm, which in turn influence us. So we need to see the ecosystems and not the algorithm alone by themselves. And to show you that, I'm going to show you two research examples where algorithms influence political communication, influence political discourse, but they are not exactly the reason why we have a problem there. And the first problem is the first case study is about newsfeed algorithms that generate what we're going to see on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, or any other platform. And the second case study is how algorithms are deployed to do content moderation, to filter misinformation, fake news, hate speech, and so on. So a lot of news articles say that algorithms change political communication. For example, that Facebook is full of angry comments, that we have a lot of right-wing news circulated, and other properties that we don't want in an inclusive political environment. We also see news that say, hey, recommendation algorithm, newsfeed algorithms of specific apps, such as that of TikTok, made recommendation to users based on their race, which automatically is a form of discrimination. And the question is, how do algorithms reach or come to provide these results? I'm going to show you a case study that we did at the Technical University of Munich by analyzing how users behave on Facebook politically. For example, we analyzed German Facebook political pages, and we saw how users engage, participate, and also how AI interacts with that user behavior to generate content to the newsfeed. So on social media platforms, we found, and it is generally known, that users are not participating actively. You can see on the left plot, for example, that more than 1 million of users were making one like, and only 5 or 10 or 50 users were generating 10 likes or 100 likes, and so on. And the same applies for comments. That means that not all people are equally active in the political discourse. So this hyperactive behavior is also imprinted on the topics that are discussed in the discussions. Hyperactive users have their own topics of interest, and you can see it on the right, on the plot. So we have a political environment where not all people externalize their opinions to the same degree, and so we have a skewness of political participation. Now, let's think how this asymmetry interacts with the recommendation algorithms, with the algorithms that generate the newsfeed. These algorithms are trained to what is called engage users to have a well-spent time. What does it mean? They are trained to show contents to users, which users are going to click on them, comment them, interact with them. And interestingly, if we think, hey, what makes people click more on a content? Usually we want to interact with something where it is provocative, aggressive, and so on. If it is average, if we don't like it too much, we will not going to engage a lot. So automatically, we have an algorithm that is trained to optimize and to maximize the interactions of users. And in this way, it promotes specific contents. Why does the algorithm do it? Because us clicking, commenting more, and so on, means us generating more data for the companies that they can use then for advertisement purposes or for other products and earn more money. So we have the economic incentives of the platforms intervening on how the algorithm actually influences political communication. The second is user activity as well. Since user activities are asymmetric, an algorithm will be trained on what it is clicked more, which does not represent, unfortunately, the average society. So we also have a problem of how the algorithm interacts with human behavior in general. And finally, we users ourselves not participate in this asymmetry. Why? We generate contents because we want to take more likes. We want to take more comments. We want to be successful in a social media platform. So we are positively reinforced ourselves to use and generate contents that will bring more likes and so on. So you see the AI algorithm saying, hey, is the AI algorithm good or bad, or is it helping democracy or not, is the wrong question to pose. Actually, we need to see, hey, how does the ecosystem behave in which a part is the algorithm, and how should we shape that so towards the civic interest. The second case study I'm going to present is algorithms and content moderation. So first we need to understand how content moderation takes place on social media platforms. So usually algorithms might scan contents or users might flag contents, and these contents will be given further to some people who work there, content moderators who based on a book of rules will decide if something will be removed or not. So for example, these articles show how these platform rules function. On the right, you can see the table that Twitter decides if they are going to remove false information or to label misinformation and so on. And we also see that since the COVID-19 crisis, platforms use more and more algorithms to filter contents. First, because we have much more misinformation related to the health crisis. Second, a lot of people could not go to work, so algorithms were doing more the work of real people. I'm going to show you a case study that we performed at the Technical University of Munich regarding content moderation. And we searched for conspiracy theories about COVID-19, and we created special, we applied special mathematical models to see first, does content moderation work? What does it mean work? If we are banning conspiracy theories, will this lead to the decrease of the appearance of conspiracy theories in the future? And we found that actually, yes, when platforms were removing contents, it was functioning. It was helping that similar contents will not reappear. We also searched if all these conspiracy theory related contents were removed. And although platforms largely used AI to filter contents, we found that in all cases, less than 50% of misinformation were filtered. So even AI cannot do something perfectly. Okay. Now, as we see, it's not then a question if AI will do something perfectly or not, or if content moderation has an effect. It has an effect. AI itself also might not do something perfectly. But the question is, what do we as a society think that something should be moderated? When and under which circumstances? For example, a tweet of Donald Trump was removed by Twitter, but the same text remained on Facebook because in one case it violated a platform's rules, in the other it did not. Down you see a picture, an Instagram post of a supermodel, of a supermodel, that she wrote that she's a proud Palestinian, and this was filtered from Instagram. So again, we need to think in which cases us as a society want things to be filtered, why and how. And the general takeaway I want to give you is that algorithms generally do what we tell them to do. Papa showed that they have specific possibilities, and you can see is that we know how algorithms behave. We know that they can do mistakes. We know that they can discriminate. We know usually ways to mitigate biases. Algorithms are not perfect. They do mistakes as humans, but they do what they do in scale. So they might do something in a greater extent. And as Christian said, then we need to think about how we design the ecosystem as a whole and not just a single part. Which are values, and since which are our values, we need to adapt them, make them clear, and given that we know how algorithms function, to create ecosystems that respect our civic values. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Orestes, in a very, very interesting presentation. I particularly envy your slides. If one day I will be able to put up slides like that, I will consider myself successful in academic life. But thanks, Dr. Orestes, and thanks to our panelists for this very, very interesting set of initial talks. And now we have the second part of our conversation. We already have a couple of very interesting questions from the audience that I'm looking forward to take them to you. But I want to give some space if any panelist wants to react to each other's presentations. Is there any remark, follow-up question that you want to make to the presentation of other panelists? So, Professor Christian, there you go. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I indeed would like to follow up because I was so interested in actually all of the presentations. So a quick question to Deborah, if I may. You mentioned those chatbots you've programmed, and I just wonder whether you have learned anything from the application, so whether you have any ideas about their effectiveness. And second part of my question, what was your ethical assessment of building those chatbots? Because of course you nudge people of what we conceive to be something good, but how did you do this ethically? And if I may, I would also like to address Orestes and Professor Papa jointly, because I enjoyed both presentations so much. And it made me think about this discussion of the founder of convolutional neural networks, Yves LeCun, who had a big started a big discussion on Facebook, on Twitter recently. It was about the question of to what extent does an algorithm reflect data, and to what extent do we tweak and influence algorithms as designers? And much of this discussion boiled down to whether we talk about AI as a whole or specific examples. But I really wonder what your take on the question is when we talk, for example, about discriminations, but also about other also good things that algorithms do. To what extent is, in your view, the data the deciding influence?
Debs, go ahead, and if any other panelist wants to jump in the discussion, please feel free to.
Sure, thank you, Professor Jafal, for the questions. They are actually very, very interesting. So, trying to answer to your first one, if we did learn something, of course, with the process, but specifically with the machine, I would say that the first thing that we learned is that the goal that we created this chatbot for has changed significantly from what we had envisioned to what it became. We envisioned this chatbot to work as the following. We nudge people into participating in the monthly meetings of their local public security councils. And this was mainly the goal. The machine has literally all the dates for the meetings, and they would be informed of that. But what we learned is that the first thing that people needed was to know about the existence of these local public security councils. So the first thing is in the flux, the conversational flux, the moment in which the user would stop is, okay, I want to know more. What are these public security councils? Because I don't know. I have never been to a meeting and I have never learned about the existence. So this is one thing that we have learned. We built the chatbot for a specific goal and we changed it, and we actually learned that. And the second thing is that the way we kind of created the metric system of the chatbot in order to understand if we were achieving the goal or not is something that is a very, I would say, Brazilian response to that. And it was the metrics that we built in which the people using the chatbot would answer, thank God, or God bless you, or things related to God in general. And this brings us an element of sort of personalization that people have with chatbots in general, and specifically with conversational AI. We tend to personify AI, and that is important. That is something that we had not taken into consideration from the beginning. Even if you see the look of the chatbot, it looks like a robot, so that we make sure that the people know that this is a robot talking to you and not a person. Of course, there are people behind it, but it's not a person. So this is a second thing. And regarding your second question about ethics, this was something very, very important for us in the moment that we were designing the chatbot. So we had issues concerning especially gender and race when we thought about, okay, so how is this chatbot going to look like? What is the persona behind of this chatbot? Is it going to be female? And if so, aren't we reinforcing the stereotypes that usually personal assistants are female, and they play a specific role in our societies when we're talking about the traditional sexual division of work? And the second one was regarding race. So how are we going to make sure that people look at this chatbot and not see it as a white savior that is going to bring them into the discussion of public security? So these two issues were very important for us from the moment that we were designing. So I think this is really important for us in civil society organizations or in organizations that are building or creating technologies using AI-based solutions. Design is everything, as you said, and I think we did try to apply this in our process. And of course, it's not foolproof, but it is what we have managed to do so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Do we have any reactions or does any other panelist wants to jump in this discussion?
Yeah, I'd like just to
go ahead
to stress what Christian said. I think in my viewpoint, these algorithms, they are data driven, and then so it really depends on what you want to do. We have a lot of, let's say, information about AI, that maybe we're changing the word, but if you have a deep look at in some very simple tasks that we humans we do kind of easily, you can see that these AI algorithms, they gonna fail. For instance, let's have an example. We have an image, and it's easy for an AI algorithm to answer that. I can ask, okay, how many persons do we have here? Or do we have a dog? Do we have a car? Right? It's easy for them to get that. But if you ask, what's going on? That's a very much complicated answer for a computer, because we need to establish some relationships in between the objects. We have, like, let's say, people and animals, they're doing some action, and we humans we are very good in getting information from different contexts and then take the decision. And just coming back a little bit, yes, I think to me they're only data driven, which means if you don't have enough data, you're not gonna get anything that very much useful, right? And we humans, we can extrapolate the data we have in a lot of different ways. So we can create things in our mind, which computers, at least by now, they can't do, right?
I would also add to
go ahead
to Papa and to answer Christian's question each algorithm is like a linear regression. Not that it does the same, it's a very complicated method to do something, but they can only do one thing. And this thing, if they are going to fit a complicated line on the data, it is dependent, of course, on the data someone puts in. So there is this pre-existing bias, so-called. So what social relations we put in the algorithms, they are going to reproduce them, but also in their own way. So an example is sometimes I was measuring bias in a specific text NLP algorithm, and it was xenophobic. So it was in favor of Germans and discriminating non-Germans, but also it associated non-Germans with tourist agencies. Because it's true, there were also data about traveling and so on. So how the algorithm made the association is not so simple as we think about it. In some way, we change it in a sense. So that's why I also believe we should always assess the algorithms when they are ready and the impact they have, and then product, and not to say, hey, we cleaned the data or we looked at some data sets, it worked fine, which is what most computer scientists do. I believe the law and the regulation should see, like every case, what effect, what consequence a decision will have, and deal with it accordingly.
Thanks, Dr. Rodestis. Let me suggest that we turn to the questions from the audience, beginning to be a little bit afraid with the time. So we have a couple of very interesting questions, both coming from Facebook and from YouTube. So I will try to pick some from each channel so that we have discussions from each side of the spectrum here of the streaming of this conversation. So for our friends from the Technical University of Munich, there's a question on Facebook from Aldeci França that asks about foreign interference in election processes and how that ends up plugging in the whole debate of AI. I think we have definitely here an ongoing conversation on the usage of bots, automatized accounts, and that ends up linking quite naturally to the sphere of foreign interference in an election process. So the question from Odyssey is there any lessons learned from the German experience? Something that you could share with us from the German background? So that's one question that comes from Facebook. A question that is somewhat related to that comes from Facebook is a question from Higino Amanajas that asks for more details on how data security interplays with the whole conversation of AI and democracy. Because since we're discussing that a lot of relations are now digitalized and we rely on data to end up deciding, including who we're going to vote for, how data security is important for that conversation. So I will begin with those two questions coming from Facebook, and then I have some set of questions coming from YouTube. So first of all, foreign interference in elections, German experience. Second, data security and AI, how much is that important for democracy? So who starts?
Okay.
Go ahead, Professor Christian.
Yes, let me first start with the legal perspective, and Orestes will then correct me from a technical, legal, and especially socio-technical perspective, which I really appreciate. But I think the first question was a little bit tied to the law, and German Parliament observes foreign intervention very closely for the federal elections, but also for European elections, and it's a big topic. So on the one hand, the question is, do we need to change the laws? At the moment, we are only at a state of observation, but I told you that there was a more general measure, the Network Enforcement Act. And this act only looked into the enforcement of existing laws and actually tried to make service providers accountable through different measures. And of course, this is also important in the case of elections, because there are time limits to that, and any action punishable by law can be tackled with this Network Enforcement Act. But what I should also mention is that there was an understanding on the German, but also the European level, which is very important for us also to think about it regionally, that this should also result in strengthening civil society, different parts of civil society, and especially the media. So to have incentives for them to tackle the issue and educate people. So there were different measures with that, because this is like a vaccine against interventions if people have digital sovereignty and are educated. And I should also mention that there is now a legislative discussion on the European level on a Digital Services Act, which will also deal with, not specific to elections, but will have an impact. So I think, to sum it up, in Germany, it was a rather broad discussion, not focused on intervention in elections, while we definitely saw this problem. And we also saw the problem of data security. So in Germany, there is a Federal Agency of Information Security, and this is not an intelligence service, but an agency that is supposed to help economy, the administration, and civil society, so normal people, to increase IT security, to help them to secure their data and their behavior. And this federal agency looked into, is now always observing also election processes in order to check. And in the last federal election, there was actually a bug in the transferal of voting results, and this had to be corrected. So it's I think also the question of data security is a very, very important question. And one thing to do to deal with that from a German perspective is to have a rather independent agency that enhances IT security with all of society. So not only with the state, but with all of society.
Thank you, Professor Christian. Anyone else?
To give my perspective, to add on Christian, which I'm not familiar with the laws, so it was great in such detail, so it was really interesting to hear it. Regarding automated accounts, for example, and foreign interference, usually automated accounts are present on Twitter, and Twitter is not popular in Germany, actually. So a person said to me once that politicians, journalists, researchers, and psychopaths use it, in the sense that there are these three groups that use it in Germany and nobody else. There are some accounts that were active in Germany, part of information operations, and they are in the datasets that Twitter publishes, because Twitter has an archive where someone can access banned accounts in the tweets, but it was very, very limited. So in general, because Twitter is not so important in Germany, I believe it has less influence also in the political discourse.
I see. If we don't have any other reactions, let me take two additional questions coming from Facebook and YouTube. So again, for our friends from the Technical University of Munich, and friends, I'm sorry for that, but that's one of the purposes of this conversation. For the Brazilian audience, we are always very interested in learning about the experiences from Germany, and especially on that issue. Some of the questions end up addressing this type of concern, of curiosity. And there's a question on how to fight fake news, and if Germany has took any legal approach to curb fake news in the country. And that question comes from Márcio, pretty much concerned with the draft bill of law that has been discussed in Brazil. I can address briefly, very briefly, the draft bill in Brazil, but we would love to hear from our friends, from our friends from the Technical University of Munich, if there is there in Germany a law to tackle fake news, and how will that work out? And there's a follow-up question from YouTube addressing some concerns raised by Yuval Harari, the Israeli writer, very popular with the Homo sapiens, Homo Deus books, like international bestsellers. And Harari has this remark about almost like this nature of technology, and especially internet and AI, to serve more, how can I say, authoritarian aspects of the political sphere. And a lot of people talk about digital populism and ways in which technology can serve purposes that end up fostering authoritarian views of politics. So I would like to put those two questions here on the table for you. One on Germany and the law on fake news, and the second one, that's a question that comes from Gustavo on the YouTube channel. How do you see this remark from Harari that says that technology, and especially internet and AI, can serve to foster this dictatorial, authoritarian aspects of how we handle politics nowadays? So, any comments?
I
Dr.
would like
Orestes,
to answer the
go ahead.
second question, and I will leave the first for Christian, who is the special with the law. I believe that, as Deborah said, technology reproduces the power relations that exist in a society. So usually those who have power, the technology serves them better. But I disagree that social media have brought this absolute digital populism. And for example, just 2 weeks ago, some teenagers on TikTok, the most downloaded app in 2020, organized themselves and sabotaged a campaign event of Donald Trump. So I believe there are always possibilities in all sides, issues, and to be overcome, definitely. But that's why I believe we need to think about how these ecosystems function as a whole and see, do we need probably a social media platform that does not function for the economic incentive of an entity or a person? Do we need advertisements? Do we need algorithms in the middle? How can we assure that political communication and political discourse is fair and diverse?
Yes, I agree, and I think it's again. I think it's about power relations, as mentioned before. So I think it tells us more about dictators and authoritarian regimes than about the technology, because they are very fast to understand and to use possibilities offered to them. While we could use, I mean, Deborah gave a lot of example, and Professor Papa as well, how we could use this for inclusion, to include, for example, disabled people. But of course, we have to have the necessity and the will to do it. So in a way, it's also a little bit of a power struggle, and it's always possible. We learned that in Europe the hard way, where the foundational aspect of the European communities, as they were founded in the 50s, was sharing technology, sharing coal and steel, which was then the really power technology, and sharing atomic technologies. And these were 2 of the 3 European communities. So it was a technology sharing project, and building around the idea that we have to share and we have to use it together in order to deal with it, and not to be too self-centric and competitive. So in a way, it's empirically it's a good observation, but I couldn't disagree more with framing technology like that. But I have to look the quote up before I criticize the Honorable Professor Harari. But just to say that this tells us not as much about technology than about us. So it's the social, as Orestes said. And let me come to the second point. I've mentioned a little bit of it in my last intervention. So in Germany, there is no specific law on fake news, but fake news can have a relevance generally. So, for example, in criminal law and certain in certain respects, for example, hate crimes, libel and the like. And the Network Enforcement Act was designed to actually enforce these measures effectively. And what we've learned so far is that, of course, social networks do something, but in order to enforce it properly, we need to build up parts of the public administration, particularly public prosecution, who has the knowledge, the skills, and the woman and manpower, the person power to do that. And in that regard, I think it's quite different from what I've learned so far about the Brazilian legislative proposal, because we don't have these measures in the Network Enforcement Act. But if you look into what this proposal talks about and the measures they take, we have all these discussions also in Germany, for example, to break end-to-end encryption. So there is a long-standing discussion more in German criminal law about having like loopholes in end-to-end encryption, or mandating real identities. It was just last year that a very famous politician brought that up, that you have to have real identities on social networks. But these were very critically discussed, and at the moment, I think the state of the discussion is that, for example, for these two measures, breaking end-to-end encryption and mandating real identities, there is a clear consensus against that in German politics so far. But it's a constant discussion, and we're having, I think, the same discussions, maybe slightly in different points, but very related. So I'm really interested in how the Brazilian proposal will evolve.
Thanks, Professor Christian. And those were two topics that have been discussed during the debates in the Senate on the Brazilian bill. There is definitely this demand by some congressmen to have real identity for people to use social network and instant messaging apps. And well, I would say luckily at this stage, the discussion on breaking end-to-end encryption has been put down for now. But I have to remember, especially for our Brazilian friends in the audience, that there is still a judicial decision pending in the Brazilian Supreme Court on the blocking of WhatsApp and on encryption as a whole. So we have two lawsuits that are still pending decision in the Brazilian Supreme Court on this very same topic that Professor Christian has just mentioned. We are almost coming to the end of our discussion, but we have two questions here from the audience that I would like to make for Professor Papa and for Deborah. So, Professor Papa, we have a question from Mary Martins from Vitoria Herrero, addressing the issue of how algorithms can change or standardized behaviors. So how do you see artificial people end up conducting their daily act? So do you see that algorithms and AI, after all, have this power to change the way people do behave online and offline? And then a quick question for Deborah as well. There is a question about WhatsApp and how do people have access to news. So when you have a lot of questions or polls saying that /% of the population end up getting their news from WhatsApp, but is that necessarily bad? Might they not be having access to links, to prestigious news sources as well through WhatsApp. So how do we understand and how do we translate this answer from polls that people say that they are usually getting their news from and informing themselves from WhatsApp? So, Professor Papa, you want to take on the question, and then we finish with Deborah. Okay. So,
yeah,
Professor,
sure.
go ahead.
I think that's an interesting question. In my viewpoint, I don't think that the behavior of the people as a whole, I mean, the people that are like walking on the streets or, I don't know, doing normal activities, I don't think that they're gonna change. What I do think that in some situations, like we say, as Deborah showed us, for public expenditures, maybe some of the people, when they're trying to do something, they're gonna think twice before doing that, because now we have an AI running backwards instead of a human trying to see if something's wrong. That may happen. But I don't think that in our daily life, probably, actually, our lives are getting changed, actually, with a lot of things that the people, they use, right, in their daily lives, but they even don't know that AI is running back, right? So yeah, I don't think that's gonna change that much, you know.
Thanks, Professor Papa. Let me just check if Deborah is connected. Deborah, you're there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay,
Are
good.
you listening?
Good. Yes.
Great.
We'll listen and see you right now. Go ahead.
Great. So thank you for the question, Professor Carlos. I think there are two issues in the question raised. One of them is regarding research itself when it comes to WhatsApp. This research that I showed you was done by, through a survey. So it was people answering those questions. So there's an issue here in which we do not have access to WhatsApp data. And then it's a problem here because as a researcher, I could not, access the data in itself and ask the questions that I have as a researcher to the data instead of asking the questions to the person. So first, there is an issue regarding methodology. And here we could even, talk about the issues regarding encryption and privacy and how could we open WhatsApp messages for researchers. And there is an issue here, and I'm not going to go a lot into it, minding our time, but this is a point. And the second one is regarding if people maybe might have access to other sources of information, WhatsApp, talking specifically about the Brazilian context, we have the issue of zero rating, which is a practice in which the telecom companies allow you to access the internet and allow you to use your data package only to a certain amount of only to a certain amount of data, but after you use your data package, the only thing you can, or even WhatsApp and Facebook. So if you do think that people might even have access to links or news media outlets, etc., they are not able to actually go to those links because they don't have
Deborah, I think we're losing
data to do that. So I think there are two issues here regarding WhatsApp, and could try to explain a.
Deborah, I think we're losing your connection, unfortunately. and then we couldn't hear you like the end of your answer. We could understand the beginning, but unfortunately we lost you in the end. And that ended up taking us to the exact time for closure of our event. I'm sorry that we couldn't hear the last part of Deborah's answer, but we can definitely come to the comments, to the channels, either on YouTube and Facebook, and make sure that we end up sending out the information that people are asking questions and such. Before closing the event, let me just say thanks for everyone in the audience. You were very participative, and it was really interesting to see how many questions that we end up having, questions that end up triggering this comparison between Brazil and Germany, what we could learn from the German experience on issues concerning elections and fake news, and addressing the very core of the debate of AI, democracy, and the law. That was the purpose of this conversation, and I'm really happy that we've managed to give you at least a glimpse of how this conversation can be interesting, can be engaging, and we really hope that this conversation end up helping you in your research, in your interest on those issues. So let me say thanks again to Professor Christian Devshal, to Dr. Orestes Papakyriakopoulos, to Professor João Paulo Papa, and to Deborah Albu for this very interesting conversation. It was great to be able to chat a bit with you. And let me just say thanks as well for the German embassy in Brazil for organizing these events with support from the Technical University of Munich, at us on ITS based in Rio. We're really happy to be able to co-host this gathering with you. So I hope you guys have enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to continue this conversation in some other opportunity in which we can continue to do this comparison between the countries and to learn from each other. So thanks again for your time and for your knowledge that you shared with the Brazilian audience on this morning. Okay, so thanks everyone. Looking forward to see you next time. So, ciao.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you very much. And thanks also
Ciao.
to the Adenauer Foundation, which we forgot today.
Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
true.
Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Até mais, pessoal.